This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. So when we say somebody is the defensive player of the year, what does that mean? What are we actually trying to award with the Defensive Player of the Year award? Are we giving it to the defensive player that makes offensive coordinators sweat the most? Are we giving it to the defensive player that's been the most talked about in this NFL season? Are we giving it to the defensive player who has had the most standout individual performances of the year? Are we giving it to the defensive player who's the most statistically impressive, who's the most analytically impressive, who is the most technically impressive? What are we giving this award for? See, Defensive Player of the Year, similar to MVP, struggles because of the amount of ground that award tries to cover. See, MVP has this problem where we don't know what an MVP is, right? The award is most valuable player. And we tell ourselves that that means it goes to the best player in all of football. But because figuring out who the best player in all of football is something that's impossible to quantify, what ends up happening with that award is that it gets monopolized by one position group because that's what we can compare to, right? Whichever position group tends to have the most candidates for that award tends to monopolize that award because that's what we as human beings can quantify and compare and say definitively, I think this player is better than this player because of this. Well, Defensive Player of the Year suffers from the same problem, not because there's a monopoly on what position can win the award, even though it's most oftenly given to defensive linemen, because again, the scalability of those comparisons between guys who've won it before and guys who've won it in the past. But Defensive Player of the Year struggles because a lot of times defense isn't something that stats really account great for. What do I mean by this? How in the world is defense not quantified well by stats? Great example. I say this all the time with Roquan Smith. If you look at the tackle numbers and you value tackle numbers, you would think Roquan Smith should be Defensive Player of the Year. But what are those tackle numbers actually saying? You have no idea, because you have no idea how many of those tackles were meaningful, because he has 160 something tackles, but like maybe 8 of them are tackles for loss. So like what are those tackles? Similarly with sacks, you can have a ton of pressures, but a little bit of sacks, and maybe that matters, right? We've seen it matter where Jadeveon Clowney was the type of guy in Cleveland to last year, at least, to get a ton of pressures, not get a ton of sacks. Same thing's happening right now with Zadarius Smith. He gets a ton of pressures, doesn't get a ton of sacks, and it does kind of affect things. But then there are guys who get a ton of pressures. They don't turn them into sacks, but they're for completely different reasons. If you're not turning your pressures into sacks because you're missing tackles, well, that's a big problem, right? So that's why you have to use some numbers with other numbers in conjunction with other numbers. So with Zadarius Smith, I pointed out the high pressure number meant nothing to me because of the high missed tackle number, which meant that he was getting pressure, but he was missing tackles. That's not good. Myles Garrett, on the other hand, does not have a high missed tackle number, which means he's getting pressure and they're just getting rid of the ball in a hurried manner in order to avoid him. See, numbers for defense are too vague. Remember Darrelle Revis and the difficulty we had quantifying Darrelle Revis's dominance. There was no doubt that Revis Island was one of the best corners in the NFL, but as he got more and more of a reputation and teams just decided to avoid him completely, it became hard to quantify that. And then you got guys like Nnamdi Asomugha popping out of nowhere and people thinking that guy's better than Darrelle Revis. Because, well, the numbers. Darrelle Revis don't do this. Well, they don't throw the Darrelle Revis. Myles Garrett is the first defensive end I've seen in my lifetime to get the Darrelle Revis treatment. They legitimately don't care about nothing else but Myles Garrett. You see it every week in the film where teams will put 3, 4 guys on Myles Garrett. All the attention is on Myles Garrett. And it's not because the guys next to him are scrubs. They respect those guys. It's just because they're that afraid of Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett has a double team percentage right now of 33%. TJ Watt is somebody who people compared to Myles Garrett a lot. Double team percentage of 15%. They both have excellent help, right? Myles Garrett has Dalvin Tomlinson, Zadarius Smith. He had Obo Okoronkwo before. Like, the Browns have been able to generate pressure outside of Myles Garrett this year, not like last year, but this is happening. Same thing with TJ Watt, right? They got help. You know, there's a reason he gets those double teams. He doesn't get those double teams. But 15% for TJ Watt, 33% for Myles Garrett. You know why that is? It's because while teams respect TJ Watt, they're not terrified of TJ Watt. Myles Garrett terrifies offensive coordinators. I will say this and say this proudly. There is not a single defensive player in the NFL that terrifies an offensive coordinator like Myles Garrett. Nobody is adjusted around more. Nobody is focused on more than Myles Garrett in a game plan on the defensive side of football. Think about all the good defensive players the Browns have. JOK, fourth time, Grant Delpit. He's injured now, but they have JOK. They have Zadarius Smith, who's been an all-pro in this league. You have Dalvin Tomlinson, who's been a Pro Bowler in this league. You got guys like Shelby Harris in that rotation. You got JOK, Denzel Ward, Martin Emerson, Greg Newsome, all of these good players, but yet all of the focus still ends up on 95. That is a player that terrifies offensive coordinators, offensive linemen, and offensive line coaches on a way that nobody has in the league in a very long time. Like, I would have to imagine you would have to go back to like Reggie White. That is how dominant and terrifying Myles Garrett is. And the fact that he had like 11 pressures last week with all of that attention on him is insane. But we don't know how to quantify that, right? Which brings me back to the fact that defensive numbers are hard to quantify when teams know that somebody is dominant. Myles Garrett is getting to Darrelle Revis. We will refuse to let Myles Garrett in this game. The only time Myles Garrett seems to be able to get involved or seems to be allowed to get involved in games is when teams are absolutely desperate and they can't help but not give Myles a chance. Other than that, they send it chips, hips, dips, slaps, baps, everything. They send it all at Myles because they're terrified of him in a way that nobody else is. It's Revis Island, but a defensive lineman. This is what's happening with Myles Garrett. Ever since Myles Garrett jumped over that dude in Indy, teams have decided no more games. Okay? No more games. I don't care who wins. We're doing this to Myles. And look, teams have made that bet and it's turned out terribly for them. And they still ain't adjust from it because they'd rather let everybody else eat on the Cleveland Browns than let Myles Garrett eat. You want to know why JOK is having this kind of a year and like second in the NFL in TFLs? It's because they're terrified of Myles Garrett. So all JOK has to do is anticipate everybody being terrified of Myles Garrett and then just slice behind that gap that they're going to leave wide open because they rather leave that gap open, let a linebacker be top 10 in TFLs, than Myles Garrett touch something. There's no way to quantify that. There's no stat to quantify that. But the truth is, no defensive player is more important to a defense than Myles Garrett. And the Browns have the best defense in the NFL. So how do you not get to the point of where I'm getting to where I'm saying, well, this guy's obviously the defensive player of the year. But instead, we fall into the trap of continuing to argue these arbitrary statistics, when what should matter for defensive player of the year isn't who provided the funnest moments on television, isn't who provided the most jaw-dropping highlights. It should be who is the best defensive player in football this year. Who made offensive coordinators sweat the most? Who did offensive coordinators want to play the least? And the evidence is overwhelming. It's Myles Garrett. It's obvious. It's there every Sunday. It's there from the referees, right? If you ask the referees who's the most dominant player in football, they'll probably say Myles Garrett, because that's the exact reason they refuse to call a holding penalty on him, because they believe that Myles Garrett, being Myles Garrett, is an unfair advantage versus a left tackle. So they'll allow a left tackle to hold. That's why they don't call it, because they think that Myles Garrett, again, is just existing. Is just such an unfair advantage. And they're not that wrong. Like, they see Myles Garrett is like the BFG in Doom. He's like that one sniper rifle in Modern Warfare 2. I forget what it is, but if you played it, you know it. They put something in the game, basically, that is so difficult to stop that it ruins the game for everybody else, and they feel like they have to nerf it. Nobody else makes referees feel like that. Nobody else makes offensive coordinators feel like that. Nobody else makes offensive linemen feel like that. That is dominance. That is a concept that we kind of understand when it comes to corners. When it came to Revis Island, we had a good understanding of this, even though at times we fell for the stat trap. Don't fall for the stat trap. And look, Myles Garrett can pop off 5 of them boys in a couple weeks and then be back into the conversation, but he should have never been out of the conversation to begin with, because the dominant play and the impact that he has on a game has been obvious if you watch, because the teams are terrified of Myles Garrett. And the defensive player of the year should go to the player who terrified offensive coordinators, offensive minds, offensive game plans, and quarterbacks the most alike. That's how we measure this. Teams weren't afraid of Ray Lewis and Ed Reed because the stats were great, even though I'm pretty sure the stats were amazing. That's not what they thought about. They thought about everything that they saw on film and everything that they did in the game plan to avoid Ray Lewis and Ed Reed. When you talk about the greatness of Troy Polamalu, you talk about how other players felt like when they played Troy Polamalu. When you talk about great defensive players, it's not the stats that you bring up. It's the feeling that you have when you play against them. It's the amount of effort that an offense will go through to avoid that player that demonstrates the respect and dominance that player has, and nobody has even remotely anywhere close to it, is Myles Garrett. That's why he's Defensive Player of the Year. Y'all have a great day. Have a better night. Peace.